Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. It's time once again for another one of our ism segments, since it is Tuesday. And today I'd like for us to consider Erastianism. Erastianism is an ism that probably the great bulk of you have never heard of, though the concept you will be familiar with. And if you have heard of it, then chances are pretty good that you are some sort of clergyman. Erastianism is the doctrine that the state, that is the civil government, should be and is supreme over the church, even in ecclesiastical matters. Now, that might sound repulsive to you if you have lived and grown up under a world where the First Amendment is fairly sacrosanct. But the reality is it's actually, to some degree, an idea that has something of a long history. In fact, at the time of the Reformation, there was a kind of compromise in dealing with what would be the people's faith, that whether or not a particular region was going to be Roman Catholic or whether it was going to be Lutheran or whether it was going to be Reformed was probably going to be decided on the basis of what the political leader in that region wanted. I know specifically in terms of the English Reformation, there was some flip-flopping back and forth between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, depending upon who was on the throne in that particular moment. And not only is this a common idea, but interesting, those of you who've been listening to this whole show for a long time know that we have this segment where we look at the Westminster Shorter Catechism. That meeting of these Westminster Divines was called by the political leadership in the United Kingdom. And in fact, the original version of the Westminster Confession of Faith, which has been edited in what are often called American versions of it, but the original version of the Westminster Confession of Faith affirms at least this much, that it is not only the liberty, but it is the duty and the responsibility of the state to convene ecumenical councils to deal with threats to the church, especially in terms of heretical theology. So a person who embraces an Erastian position certainly has a lot of friends in the history of the church, and even some creedal support in the original version of the Westminster Standards. But here in these United States, we have a different view. And by the way, just for the sake of clarity, you should know this, that when the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights was ratified, many of the states, the majority, I think, of the states, had an established religion. That is, a particular denomination recognized as authoritative and supported by the government of that particular state. And the First Amendment is not so much about what any government may or may not do, but only about what the federal government may not do. The federal government was forbidden from establishing a national church, but Each state could do so if they wanted to. And again, many of them did for many, many years. So an Erastian perspective, again, is the one that would look at the state, the government, the civil government, as a supreme authority over the church. Now, I loved how my father used to teach on these kinds of ideas. When he would speak on separation of church and state, he would say this. He would say he's absolutely supportive of the concept of a separation of church and state, that it's not the function of the government to exercise authority over the church. And really, in one sense, how you feel about Erastianism can be profoundly influenced by how much you trust the government versus how much you trust religious leaders. Being a limited government guy myself, Erastianism is really, really scary. When I think about how bad the government is, how bad the government thinks, I don't want them trying to tell me what to do. But my father would say, it's one thing to affirm and believe in the separation of church and state. It's another thing to affirm and believe in the separation of the state and God. God is the one who establishes the church and gives authority to those who are in authority over it. God is the one who establishes the state and gives authority there for those who have the authority there. It's not that anyone is out from under the authority of God. And that those of us who are eager to see a government reflect the wisdom of God and the law of God are not guilty of becoming theocrats or Erastians, because we're not asking for the state to be the church or the church to be the state. We're asking for both of them to acknowledge that God is sovereign over each one. So Erastianism is an old idea that probably we look askance at, but I suspect that's more to do with our political training than it is our biblical training. I'm not saying that Erastianism is biblical. I'm just saying, the reason it freaks us out is probably because we're Americans. We come now in our ongoing study of the parables of Jesus to that parable which is almost certainly my favorite parable. And in fact, this account may be my favorite text in the whole of the New Testament. This particular account has shaped my own thinking, my own understanding of the gospel, my own sort of shaped my heart is a good way to put it. It just means so much to me. We find it in Luke chapter 18, beginning in verse 10. I think you'll recognize it quickly enough. 2 men went up into the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing afar off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified, rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Now you may think that this means so much to me because I've lived a life wherein I've been looked down upon as a tax collector, and I'm just rejoicing over the comeuppance that the Pharisee receives, and so glad to see this humble tax collector who's humble like me receiving God's grace. No. In fact, the reason this means so much to me, the reason it shaped me so much, is that I find myself on both sides of the picture here. Very, very much can see myself as this Pharisee. And in fact, not only was I very much like this Pharisee, but I could have prayed this prayer. God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, Arminians, Democrats, public school teachers, but I homeschool. I vote for limited government. I have sound doctrine. You see, the issue with the Pharisee is not what he boasted about. It's not at all a bad thing to fast twice a week. It's not a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing to give tithes of all that we get. It's also, by the way, I don't want you to miss this. Sometimes I think we're a little too hard on the Pharisee, because while he is certainly boasting, at least he had the wisdom to pray, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men. He doesn't say, God, you should thank me that I'm not like other men. So he does recognize that even the good that he's accomplished, he owes a debt of gratitude to God. That's why I think this is really a very powerful picture of the distinction between the Roman Catholic gospel and the biblical gospel. Because the way Roman Catholic view of the infusion of the grace of Christ, when we cooperate with the means of grace, we become just in ourselves. It's still grace. It's still a gift from God, but it becomes what we are rather than what we're called. And so very much anyone embracing Roman Catholic theology could pray exactly as this Pharisee does. But our calling is to acknowledge the reality of our sin, to acknowledge the reality of our dependence upon God's grace. One of the other things that's very important to notice about this is the tax collector, understand this, the tax collector is not able to expound on the distinction between infusion and imputation. He doesn't understand that his justification is forensic. He doesn't understand the nuances, which are vitally important. Don't misunderstand me. But he doesn't understand them. The reason justification by faith alone matters is not because, and I hope you understand this, nobody is saved by believing in justification by faith alone. We're saved by resting in the finished work of Christ alone. Here, this man doesn't even know the finished work of Christ. It's not finished. It hasn't happened yet. All he knows is he's got nothing except the hope of the mercy of God. Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. I'm not bringing anything to the table. I'm not boasting. I'm not cooperating. I'm not this. I'm not that. I got nothing. I've got this big bag full of filthy rags, and that's all it is. My only hope is in your mercy. This just knocks me over. This is the gospel so powerfully presented that it just, well, it feeds my soul. And I hope it feeds yours too. It doesn't happen often, but it had happened. A book written for businessmen had jumped a fence and become something of a universal bestseller. Like the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People before it and Good to Great after it, people were talking about this book, including in the office where I worked. As I passed by the receptionist's desk, she had it open, reading during her lunch. What do you think? she asked innocently enough. Well, I answered, there may well be some good wisdom in that book. If there is, however, that wisdom isn't unique to that book. And if there is anything unique about that book, I suspect it isn't wisdom. Because the Bible equips us for every good work, the truth is that we already have all that we need. Our best teachers, then, are not those bringing us new truths, but those bringing us old truths. While the world may celebrate creativity, the creation of previously unknown ideas, the church celebrates fidelity, the propagation of previously revealed ideas. Jesus himself, while certainly noted for the authority with which he spoke, was always quick to remind his audience that he didn't speak his own words, but the words his Father gave to him. See John 12:49. Even the notion that we must be born again in order to enter into his kingdom, even that is something that Jesus assumes the Pharisee Nicodemus must already know about, as he says in John 3:10. Jesus is about the business of reminding his own of what they have forgotten. The same, of course, is true about his call to us, that we should pursue his kingdom and his righteousness. This is not some sort of course correction. The message of Jesus is not, well, the prophets did their best, but they steered you wrong. And that's why I've come, to tell you to stop listening to them and start listening to me. The pursuit of his kingdom and his righteousness was always God's call on our lives. Adam and Eve, as they left the garden, were called to pursue his kingdom and his righteousness. Noah and his family, as they walked out of the ark, were called to pursue his kingdom and his righteousness. Abraham, by faith, was called righteous and called to seek that city whose builder and maker is God. Because we are 21st century Westerners, we think that which is old is passé, outdated, and that which is new as improved. The truth is, we are called to move forward. We should be enjoying in the church generational sanctification as we stand on the shoulders of those who stood on the shoulders of those who stood on the shoulders. But we get better not by getting newer, but by getting older. We are reformers, not revolutionaries. I'm reminded of this every time I'm blessed to sing "All People That on Earth Do Dwell," the old 100th. We sing the same song the people of God have sung for 3,000 years. To be sure, we don't know what tune David composed, and we sing an English translation rather than in Hebrew. But we're going back to the wisdom of God revealed to our fathers in the days of David. We, too, are called to make a joyful shout to the Lord. Indeed, we are the all you lands that were called to so shout. We, too, are called to serve the Lord with gladness, to enter his gates with gladness, to be thankful to him, and to bless his name. We are the sheep of his pasture precisely because he is merciful. The psalm ends with this reminder of why all our reforming is a returning. And his truth endures to all generations. Friends, we are not modernists trying to climb an intellectual tower of Babel. We are not evolving toward wisdom. We are instead always reforming because we are always returning back to our Father, back to the Word, back to our primordial paradise. In eternity, it will be the same. There we will never have to unlearn, for we will be without sin. But we will continually learn more and more, know more and more the glory of our Heavenly Father. We will move further up and further in, growing into all that he will reveal. He is wisdom precisely because he is the Ancient of Days. And to the everlasting glory of his name, we rejoice in knowing that we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.